Whenever we picture a prison sentence, we think of people awaiting a death sentence. However, some prisoners survive their sentences only to enter a world that is completely alien to them. Here are 5 convicts who survived insane prison sentences. Number 1. Joe Lygen. Dubbed America's longest juvenile lifer, Joe Lygen recently stepped out of prison a free man after spending 68 years behind bars. Joe Lygen's case highlights the weaknesses of America's justice system and how it discriminated against colored people in the past. Being a young man of color in a white neighborhood placed Lygen in a position where he was closely watched. He was 15 when a fateful night changed his life forever. Lygen met a few teenagers he barely knew and started drinking wine. After draining 2 bottles, the teenagers lost control of their senses and unleashed a stabbing spree on the streets of South Philadelphia that left 2 dead and 6 injured. According to Lygen, it was the first time he ever drank wine, and the boys with him that night weren't even his friends. He only knew them by their nicknames. The murders were all over the papers, and the group of teens was called the Headhunters. When Lygen's case went to trial, his lawyers instructed him to plead guilty, and he admitted to stabbing 1 victim, who survived his wounds. The judge sentenced him to life in prison with no chance of ever getting out, and just like that, his childhood turned into a lifelong nightmare. Do you think the sentence is justified, considering he was only 15? Lygen's case is a perfect example of disproportionate punishment for someone not guilty of homicide. According to his lawyer, if Lygen's case went to trial today, he would be found guilty of robbery, aggravated assault, or attempted murder, charges that would get a sentence of 5 to 10 years. But instead, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole when he was only 15. That took away any opportunity for him to change or contribute to society. Today, as a free man, Lygen is all alone, with most of his friends and family already dead, and he is forced to live in a world he barely recognizes. If you thought Lygen's sentence was unfair, you wouldn't believe the surprising details of the next case. Number 2. Charles Edrick Ford. Charles Edrick Ford went to prison at 19 and spent 64 years behind bars for a crime he never committed. He was jailed in the mid-1970s when racism was rampant in the United States, and his case marks the incompetency of the justice system of that time. Ford was sentenced to life in prison for first-degree murder in 1952, but the most disturbing fact about this verdict is that he wasn't even present at the scene when the crime happened. Unfortunately, this wasn't the only time America's justice system failed Ford. He was charged again in 1975 with second-degree assault while out of prison for a leave of absence. The woman attacked saw a man who looked like Ford standing next to a red car. This man started chasing, shouting threats to kill her. The woman's sister heard her screams and went to help her. That's when the suspect fled the scene. The red car the suspect was standing next to was registered as a rental in the name of Charles Ford, but he wasn't responsible for the second crime, any more than he was responsible for the first one. In both trials of 1952 and 1975, the entire jury was white, including the judge, and although there was hardly any evidence against Ford, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. If it wasn't for Judge Helen Harrington, who reopened Ford's case in 2016, the prisoner might have breathed his last inside his prison cell too. The real suspect in the 1952 case, Jake Robinson, eventually confessed to the crime, and a court review found no evidence that implicated Ford. He was finally released on March 23 of 2016 at 84 years old, but his happiness was short-lived as he was diagnosed with an aggressive form of lung cancer. He spent his last few months surviving off charities and donations as he did not receive a single penny in compensation for his wrongful conviction. Charles Ford finally died after spending most of his life in prison for crimes he didn't commit. The next prisoner outlived his prison sentence but made a shocking request to go back after he was released. Johnson, Van Dyke, Grigsby. Van Grigsby was an African-American born in February 1886. In 1900, his family moved to Kokomo, Indiana, the county seat of Howard County. 7 years later, his life took a nasty turn when he got into a fight with a white man in a saloon in Anderson, Illinois. What followed was nothing unusual. It just looked like 2 men fighting over a game of 5-card stud poker. However, things took a turn for the worse when the white man, James Brown, pulled a knife on Van, but Van wasn't going to back down and went outside the bar to retrieve his own knife. When he returned, Brown picked up a chair and threw it at Van. Van lunged at Brown with his knife and stabbed him to death. Grigsby pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was convicted in 1908. He was delivered in a horse-drawn cart to the Indiana State Penitentiary in Michigan City, a ride that lasted several days. From that day onwards, Van's identity changed to prisoner number 4045. He remained an inmate for 66 long years, of which 50 were spent in a ward for the insane. Ultimately, a doctor examined him and declared he was not crazy. Although he was a model prisoner who passed his time reading the Bible, a dictionary, and a complete set of encyclopedias, his request for parole was denied 33 times until he was finally released. Why do you think his parole was repeatedly denied? When Grigsby was released in December 1974, the world had changed for him completely. He was a 90-year-old man who had missed 7 decades of his life, and while he was motionless behind bars, everything else had transformed outside. Van found himself unable to cope with such drastic change and voluntarily returned to prison for 17 months until he was released again. This time, he went to live at the Marion County Healthcare Center, where he found solace following a fixed daily routine, much like his life in prison. He passed away at 101 years. The next prisoner is another victim of a miscarriage of justice, and the details of his case will leave your mind reeling. Number 4, Francis Smith. Francis Smith is the longest-serving prisoner in the state of Connecticut. A longtime petty criminal, Smith was indicted for his part in the killing of a night watchman at the Indian Harbor Yacht Club on the Greenwich Shore. The trial that ended in a Bridgeport courtroom led to a 70-year-long nightmare for Smith, who spent most of his life in prison for a crime legal experts believe he was innocent of. Does this case sound familiar? Smith escaped from a prison farm in Enfield in 1967, triggering a massive manhunt that lasted 12 days. He was also on parole for 10 months before landing himself back in prison for committing a violation in 1975. Legal officials have questioned the length of his sentence and how his murder conviction was handled nearly 3/4 of a century ago. If you look at the details of his case, 2 guns and 2 shooters were involved in killing the 68-year-old watchman. One of the shooters, George Loudon, immediately took a plea deal offered by the state's attorney, giving up the other suspect's name, Francis Smith. Loudon exited prison in 1966 and later confessed that law enforcement authorities forced him into naming Smith as the shooter. Believe it or not, a key witness also retracted her testimony implicating Smith as the second shooter. Smith's case became even more transparent when another petty criminal, David Blumetti, serving time in an Alabama prison, came forward and confessed to killing the Greenwich watchman. But despite the absence of substantial evidence, Smith was convicted of first-degree murder, and his appeals were also turned down in 1965 in federal court. Can you imagine an innocent man who probably spent 70 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit? Not only was his case grossly mishandled due to prosecutorial misconduct, but he was never given a fair chance to prove his innocence. Smith was sentenced to death, but only 2 hours before his trip to the chair, the key witness testified she wasn't sure if he was even there at the scene of the crime. Smith survived the death penalty and was eventually released in September 2020. He is 96 years old and currently living in a nursing home near Hartford, Connecticut. If you thought Smith's sentence was outrageous, you'd never believe how the trial of the next convict ended. John Phillips. John Phillips was convicted of sexually assaulting a 5-year-old girl in North Carolina. He was only 18 when he was sent to the state mental hospital for black people for a psych evaluation. His reports revealed that Phillips had the brain of a 7-year-old child, and his lawyer suggested that he plead guilty to avoid execution. However, the judge didn't consider his mental age and sentenced him to life. Although Phillips pleaded guilty, he always maintained his innocence, but it was difficult to prove that innocence, as all his medical and court records disappeared over time. Interestingly, studies have revealed intellectually disabled defendants are more likely to make false confessions. Phillips was eventually sent to the state penitentiary, where he spent several decades moving from one minimum security prison camp to another until he finally came to Durand Correctional Center in 1989. Phillips's case came to light in 1991 when Durham newspaper wrote about his status as the longest-serving inmate. Phillips's remaining family discovered the article and were allowed a chance to meet him in prison. You'd think Phillips would want to get out and live with his family, but what happened next surprised the authorities. The The police wanted to release him, but Phillips had no intentions of leaving now. He was accustomed to his life in prison and was too afraid to venture out into the unknown. He was eventually released on parole on March 9, 2021, after spending a total of 68 years in prison. His parole date ends on March 8, 2026. That's all for today, folks. Remember to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and press the notification bell for more shocking videos.